Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, returning after having had a difficult week moving a lot of things around. I am Nicholas Lorimer, and today I am joined by two of my colleagues from the Institute of Race Relations, Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you, sir?
Good, Nick. Glad to have you back.
Good to be back. And Mr. Gabriel Crouse, who very bravely took on hosting the show on Thursday last week. So thank you very much to you, Gabriel.
It ain't easy. I'm very glad to have you back, Nick.
It's good to be back. Right. Let us start off with a little bit of news that you should look out for. And this will probably be, there'll be articles about this on the dailyfriend.co.za. And if you go to the rr.org.za and you click the media button, you can see our press statement on this. I'm sure you'll see it in bits of media by the time this podcast comes out. But basically, the IRR is asking government and banks what exactly is going to happen to bonds under EWC. Who's going to pay them? If the government expropriates your property without compensation, are you going to still be left with the loan payments on your house or your farm or whatever it is that's been expropriated from you? And this is an incredibly important detail for how it affects people's lives. And so it's very important that we do get an answer from government and from the banks about exactly how this is going to work. Anyway, there'll be more on that story going forward in the week. But let us get into the news of today. And that is that there was another explosive, exciting ANC National Executive Committee meeting over the weekend, which was reported on very heavily by the media, and lots of sparks and people fighting with each other. And the upshot of it is that there still seems to be a bit of a deadlock over Ace Magashule, who is the General Secretary of the ANC, and who it seems like Ramaphosa has at least some inclination towards getting rid of. But in order to protect him, his allies on the National Executive Committee of the ANC say that if push comes to shove and they are unable to block an order telling him to step aside because of the corruption allegations against him, they will resign en masse and force a new elective conference, an early elective conference, in the ANC, which will see Cyril Ramaphosa have to fight once again a very big internal battle to stay president of the ANC and probably stay president of the country. So, Terence, what do you make of this story? What do you make of the fight? And is Cyril going to win, as many people, particularly in the sort of Media 24 orbit, have told us? Or is it far less certain than that? And yeah, let me start with that.
Well, as we say, a week is a long time in politics. Weakness is not a great commodity in politics. My inclination here is that Cyril Ramaphosa, if you want to call it the Ramaphosa faction, has probably got something of a numerical upper hand. There's the advantages of incumbency. So I think that if one's concern is simply a lineal will he survive, my inclination is to say yes. On the other hand, you do have the president of Thabo Mbeki, who bestrode the country like a colossus. I remember, even as he was being defenestrated, there was a piece, I think it was in the Star, about how he had the world eating out of his hands, and well, evidently not so much. But I do think that shows that there are if any proof was needed, the ANC has been a dreadfully factionalized organization for a generation, probably from very much more than that. And I think it's it's the Humpty Dumpty that you can't really put back together again. But maybe just to stretch that metaphor somewhat incredulously, I think they would all rather sit on the wall together than risk destabilizing it, because if there is a fall, it could be from a very great height and with many eggshells cracking. I am skeptical that you would be able to get the sort of support for a mass resignation. I think that would be that would be a political earthquake. Possible, perhaps, but I'd be fairly confident to say that that's not going to happen. I think the most likely outcome is that we simply stay locked in this kind of Cold War, for the foreseeable future.
Right. I think that's very, very reasonable assessment. But Gabriel, I want to get you in on this. Firstly, do you have anything to add to Terence's take there? And secondly, does it really matter whether Ace lives or dies in the ANC and whether Ramaphosa stands triumphant or defeated?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it does not. And that sense is policy. In politics, it's nice to distinguish the policy questions from the personnel questions. And when Cyril Ramaphosa ran for the presidency of the ANC against Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma in 2017, I remember a moment on the day before the Nasrec election where a local Johannesburg radio station, I think it was Power FM or something, had callers phone in and they would read out quotes to the callers from speeches. And they'd say, can you guess whether Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma said this or whether Cyril Ramaphosa said this? And there were 10 callers, 10 guesses, and 8 got it wrong and 2 got it right. And the point that the radio's hosts were trying to make was that both candidates had said both things. Both candidates had said, no, look, if you let us get in there, we're going to get rid of the corrupt. We're going to change policy in ways that will grow jobs and grow the economy. We're going to streamline and efficientize moribund state-owned enterprises. We're going to make sure that electricity flows like the rain in a storm as much as you want. And it was hard at that point to distinguish them on the basis of their words, but there was a very strong belief amongst many South Africans that Cyril Ramaphosa stood for something different to what Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma stood for, that he really would make policy changes, that he really would get rid of corrupt officials and so on. And the last 3 years or 4 years, three and a bit years, have shown that not to be the case, have shown his discharge of power to be very much a continuation of the status quo, maybe at a slightly changed pace, which is to say an accelerated pace. Jacob Zuma could not drive forward expropriation without compensation. He had, by the late stage of his presidency, just lost too much credibility. Cyril Ramaphosa came in with a fresh face, managed to sell himself as someone who hadn't belonged to the sort of ANC that had come before, and used that fresh credibility to drive forward that signature policy, and has used coronavirus to set up the NHI and so on and so forth. So I think that the question about internal faction fighting in ANC politics it's just important not to fall into the trap, which I think was reasonable in 2018 and 2017, of thinking that it's an ideological battle. I see very little to justify the thought that there's two ideas of policy. There seems to be one idea of policy, but two ideas of which personnel should benefit most directly from that policy and should drive the policy going forward. And in that regard, I think Terence's assessment is perfectly accurate. One should expect the most likely scenario to be a deadlock, and the second scenario to be, for the ace side to lose. But I just want to add that an important fact to bear in mind is Cyril Ramaphosa's personal popularity exceeded that of the ANC's in polling sort of before the coronavirus. So he has that advantage over all of his opponents within the ANC. How he uses it, we have seen and we will continue to see. I would say, in a word, not very much.
Right. No, that's completely correct. I'd also like to say that Cyril probably had more capacity to push forward something like expropriation without compensation than Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma would have had, because there were so many in the media and in business who so believed in him and this idea, this narrative of the long-term grand strategy that he was running, that they were willing to cut him an enormous amount of slack, and still are to some degree, on these policy questions. And so people who would have staunchly opposed expropriation without compensation under NDZ are now either going along with it or just sort of sitting quietly on the side, not really sure what to do. Terence, any concluding thoughts to add to this before we move on to our next topic?
Not really. A strain or in the ANC or a deadlock in one of their meetings is pretty much what we've come to expect now. It's a sort of fettered armed truce, if you like. But yes, I think in ideological terms, there is also a sort of sinister continuity that runs between whatever factions you might identify.
Right, and the point we often make, and our CEO Frans Cronje often makes, is there really was an ideological shift of a kind between Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, but evidence that such a shift has happened under Ramaphosa is fairly thin, to say the least. Anyway, let us continue on. Obviously, this will be in the news for some time yet, until one faction triumphs. Or if neither triumphs, it'll just sort of go on forever until the ANC is dead and buried.
Until Jesus comes, I think is the phrase.
Until Jesus comes, as our former president was happy to tell us. Right. So I'm sure many people have followed this story a bit. Former Vice Chancellor of WITS, Adam Habib, got into a bit of controversy because he said the racial slur, the N-word. He used it apparently in a discussion with students. He was told that this was unacceptable by some of those students, and there's now been a big fallout from that. So Gabriel, I'm just going to go to you because I think you understand exactly what happened a little bit better than I. You've actually watched the video taken of this event. What did he say? Now he's been suspended from the university where he was working, which is, I believe, the London School of Oriental Studies.
Oriental and African Studies, Oriental
and African Studies, correct, sorry. And yeah, so he's now been suspended from that after a vote of no confidence in him. Firstly, what happened? And why is there such a fuss?
Yeah, so what happened is they were having a discussion, Adam Habib and some students were having a discussion, and the issue was raised of a case, an alleged case where someone had used the N-word as a slur. And Habib was basically responding to say that this kind of behavior is unacceptable, that if anyone is insulting someone else using the N-word, they will face disciplinary action. And in saying that, he said the full word, which I'm not going to do for the simple reason that, I don't want this podcast to be sort of taken down. Now, a funny thing about SOAS is that it's very grounded. I know quite a few students at SOAS and people who've graduated from there. They're very familiar with a philosophical distinction, speech acts, an idea that comes from W.H. Austin, was propounded by Judith Butler. These are sort of mainstay philosophers or critical theorists of the SOAS school. And the thought is to make a vow, for example, is to change the world. That's why it's a speech act. You're really doing something quite important. So if I say, I vow to live with you until the end of our times, if you make a wedding vow, you've changed the world. If you say that person made a vow to someone else, you're not changing the world, you're describing the world, right? So this is a fancy way of saying something that we all know, which is it's different to use a slur to insult someone, which is somehow changing the world by dissing them, by disesteeming them, by degrading them, versus sort of just describing or quoting an event, which is not insulting anyone. So firstly, the students pretended not to know that difference. And now, the EFF and a majority of the SOAS students and some of the staff and so on have also pretended not to know the difference. I think it's particularly galling that the EFF has made political hay out of this, given the main use of the N-word as a derogatory term that I'm familiar with in South Africa is coming straight out of the EFF. Just a month ago, Ndlozi called Reddy Klabi a house N-word. because he didn't like her way of thinking. Gwen Ngwenya has been called a house N-word. Sihle Ngubesi has been called a house N-word. There's just lots of people, black people that don't sort of propound socialism, I guess, are described as house N-word, and it's offensive. It is, and it shouldn't be done. It shouldn't be on. I think why it's important is an interesting question. Besides, obviously, the significance for Adam Habib's life and the credibility of SOAS, there's why is this so important to critics? Well, they said, the problem isn't that Habib used the word. A black person can use the word, and they can use it in any which way. They can use it insultingly. They can use it joyously or ironically. They can quote it. The problem is that he didn't have enough melanin in his skin. And I think that if you look at the kind of theory that is propounded at SOAS, and I'm very sympathetic to this theory, that race is a social construct, you find that in order to keep the construct of race alive, in order to keep it meaningful, you have to have rules of behavior, codes of conduct that cut differently across races. So that Indian people ought to do this and not that. Black people ought to do that and not this. White people ought to do the other, but not 1, 2, and 3. That is fundamental. That was fundamental to the apartheid project. It was fundamental to the Nazi project, to pan-Slavism in Russia before communism and World War I. It's just always how it works. So the idea that I think a non-racialist would find the easiest to accept is that no one ought to use a racial slur as a racial slur ever. And anyone ought to be able to quote it descriptively. That's one set of rules. And that is thoroughly antagonistic to the racialist's idea, to the person who wants to keep race alive, who says, no, here's what matters. If you look like this, you can use these words. If you look like that, you can use those words. And SOAS is going to die on this hill, it looks like, to preserve the codes of conduct that cut differently across race. And Habib, it does look like he's toast. I mean, I am completely surprised. My initial response was that I thought his credibility would be sufficient to turn this into a teaching moment for SOAS students that believe this racialist idea, that you look at the skin color to see what someone ought to do. But it looks like I was wrong. It's an ongoing story, and we'll see if he really is dismissed. But right now, it looks like he will be.
And so one of the aspects to the story is that he certainly made himself a lot of enemies on the far left internationally, but particularly, I think, in some of the university circles, by opposing some of the most radical and violent ideas of the Fees Must Fall student protests that went on at Wits while he was the vice chancellor. Of course, that's where the EFF came to be very hostile towards him. And so I think at least some of what's going on here is simply an attempt by those groups to use this as an excuse to get rid of someone they didn't like for a long time. The EFF seems to have been able to shape some of the public opinion, at least in SOAS, from South Africa. So they seem to have an influence in London. So firstly, Terence, I want to ask you, what do you make of that? And secondly, it does seem really like, this is sort of the end of context. It's not the first time we've ever seen this happen from the sort of woke crowd. But it's a slightly more terrifying development, I think, in the destruction of the ability of people to speak language without fear of repercussion.
Yeah, look, I think that I was a little surprised that he went the full Monty on using the word as opposed to a euphemized N-word or whatever. Given the sensitivities around that sort of thing, I also think that there was something a little disingenuous about saying, well, in South Africa that's not a slur. But I think that misses the bigger picture. Yes, he was using it. He was quoting, and in fact, he was saying that if someone used this word, there will be consequences for them. In other words, he seemed more to be agreeing than disagreeing with the original proposition. But yeah, I think that looking at some of the finer details, he said I think it was on Twitter that he comes from a political background which is focused on class rather than on race. And I think what he was saying was intellectually defensible, that people can legitimately have different opinions about what constitutes the locus of political action and the most appropriate form. But when you're dealing with with something like this, the critical race theory, the wokeistas, you don't get to do that. It's rather like saying, like going into a fundamentalist church and saying, you guys come from a point of view where you believe in God and Jesus and whatever, and that's great. And I come from a position where we don't believe in God and Jesus and stuff like that. And it's all equidistant. You are. He has transgressed into what is essentially a matter of elemental esoteric importance to these young activists, and there's probably very little that he can say that will expunge that. I think that it demonstrates the kind of atrophy of academic life and academic detachment. Where, as I say, I personally would not have avoided using that word, and I think that prudence perhaps should have demanded that he did too. But I think in any kind of sort of sane academic environment, that would be grounds for I'm sorry, I should have been more careful with my choice of words, and we all move on. Now, to have a 98% of your unionized staff saying that you must that they have no confidence in you, and 2% abstaining, which suggests to me there wasn't a single one who was willing to say, well, you can carry on. That's disturbing, and that's problematic. But yeah, this I'm afraid seems to be an affliction that is gripped academic life in many parts of the world. I remember some years ago watching a podcast, and I can't for the life of me remember where it was, but one of the panelists said that he started off in a fundamentalist Christian college in America, and then went to Harvard. He said, going into this Christian school, you had to sign a form that you believed certain things and you would not act in certain ways. And he said, and your life was pretty tightly controlled and scripted. He said, but it was nothing on what actually happened to him when he got to Harvard, in terms of the boundaries of what you were able to say and what you were able to believe. Which raises the point, is this ideology, or is this religion? And is there a difference? I think that Professor Habib has some views which are highly contentious, but he is, despite being by his own description of the left, he has always come across as being rather open to being willing to engage, to discuss things on their merits, and give him his due for that. I think that to try and wreck his career, irrespective of where he stands ideologically, would be a momentous loss.
Right. No, I do agree with that. And I will say that I'm not particularly well disposed towards Adam Habib. I think he's the only person who I've ever, to his face, called a racist in my life. So I don't have great love for the man, but this really is completely crazy, what he's been taken down for. And I think it's appropriate for anyone who believes in sort of free exchange of ideas and just straight up common sense to defend him here. There's one more thing I want to talk about very briefly, Gabriel. I don't know how brief we can be on this because it's a little bit of a big one, but let me try. One of the interesting things about this is how, we have this black consciousness definition of black, which is basically anyone who's suffered from sort of like oppression by white supremacy. So this comes out of the apartheid era and before, and so Indian and colored people have often been called black as well. But in this case, Adam Habib, who I'm not sure what race he is, but he's not. I think he's colored. Anyway, one of the students told him, a black student told him that you cannot use that word because you are not black. So it's this black consciousness definition to me has always seemed a little bit weaselly in the way that it's used by especially political figures, but also ideologues. Is that when it suits their purposes, the sort of gate of blackness is very wide, and when it doesn't suit their purposes, it's very narrow. What do you make of that, Gabriel? Just before we move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think political theory will tell you that minorities are the kinds of groups, along socially salient cleavages, are the kinds of groups that depend upon constitutional limits to parliamentary action, so that the tyranny of the majority can't impose its will nefariously upon them. And so if South Africa had 3 minorities that were all being left out of BEE, whites, Indians, and coloreds, that would be more of a problem. It would make the tyranny of the majority argument stronger. It would make the argument against BEE seem more like the kind of argument that a constitutional court would have to face, or constitutional drafters would have to speak to. Having just the one racial minority makes that easier. So certainly it's prudent. I think it's also reflective of something very important, which is that during apartheid, colored people and Indian people were oppressed on the basis of their race. So I have some sympathy for the sort of black definition in BEE. As you say, it's not always applied. And I wouldn't be too harsh on people in the UK not applying it, because they have their own conventions about how to speak. I think the real issue is, as I say, that there are these norms of conduct. I think Adam Habib did nothing wrong. And if he had been a white person, or a Han Chinese person, or a Slav, or a Gael, or a Teuton, or a Anglo-Saxon, I mean, list the races. I can't think of any race according to which what he did would be wrong. But that's because my view is there are no norms of conduct which are race indexed. There are wrong things to do. Using a racial slur to hurt someone is always wrong, no matter what race you are. And I join very much many black Americans, for example, like Larry Elder and Thomas Sowell and Denzel Washington, who are super against any black person using the N-word because they think it just drives a bad kind of what I would describe as distribution in the esteem market. So that's my view, but it's not the SOAS view. And I think Terence correctly describes it at what was the phrase, elemental and esoteric. It's as deep as the heart goes. It is a matter of the soul, right? And he is confronting that article of faith that no amount of common sense or reason will bridge. It is a power play, and he is losing the power play because he doesn't have the votes.
Right, exactly. Anyway, unfortunately, I doubt this is the last we're going to hear of this type of thing happening. Hopefully, the investigation that's now being had into Habib will be resolved in his favor. But I have my doubts. And yeah, this is definitely not the last time we're going to see someone getting raked over the coals for something completely defensible. Right, let us move on to our last story for today, and that is some terrible news coming out of Mozambique. Now we've talked a little bit about this on the show, but last week there was an attack on the northern Mozambican town of Palma, which is in the Cabo Delgado region, which is in the north of Mozambique. It's a majority Muslim area, I believe. It's also has a planned massive gas extraction project there being run by the energy company Total. There's been this Islamist insurgency, which calls itself the Islamic State Central African Province. They have been launching lots of attacks in the region. The Mozambican army has not had a lot of success in putting them down. In fact, the Mozambican army seems to just be oppressing people. And now it seems to have killed a large number of people in the town, just as Total thought that the situation was safe enough to begin reopening its gas working operations. I see we've run out of time there, so there isn't much to say on this, except I think that I'll conclude by saying that if South Africa was a proper country that did sort of believe in its peace on the African continent ideals, I think it would take a much more active role in trying to combat this insurgency and bring peace and stability to Mozambique. But unfortunately, our institutions, such as the SANDF, have been left to rot. And the government doesn't really care about what, despite all of its professed belief in the peace and security of Africa, doesn't seem to really care too much about our neighbors. And of course, this will probably have negative consequences on South Africa, because what happens over there probably won't stay there forever. But it's a story we'll return to again. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Thanks, everyone.